Hi everyone, it's Neil here. Just testing the audio and making sure everything's up and running. If you haven't already, please click on the Q&A button bottom left in the video to join the questions and answers session. You do need a Google account, I'm afraid. It's all done through Google Hangouts. Failing that, you can always welcome to just listen in on the webinar. It is recorded, so there will be a copy, an edited copy that we'll put up after the session. And as you go through, if you need to rewind it at all, you can change the slider bar, so there's no problem if you need to take a call or something. We should be setting off at about past. Just wait for a few more people to come online. I think the notifications are going out as we speak, so hopefully there'll be a few more people a little longer. So yeah, as we go through, there will be opportunity to ask any questions you might have, and I'll try and answer them live. Oh, I should mention as well, at the end of the session, I always leave a bit of time there to take more questions. And if if there's something that's a little bit more off topic, then that's a good time to do that. For those people who are already here, that was just a quick preview of what it's to come a bit later on when I look at the demo. Just make sure everything's ready and logged in. So we should be should be starting at 12:30. There's a few slides to run through, just the introduction of MailStore, and then I'll go through the actual demonstration. We will be using MailStore version 9 today, which isn't technically released, but it's due in the next few weeks, so I thought it was worthwhile showing some of the changes there as well. Thanks, James. Just always good to know. I should point out, actually, there's about worked out about a 90-second delay between when questions come through and then when it's actually broadcast and you can see it. So please bear with me if you've sent a question and I don't seem to be addressing it. I probably haven't received it by that point. So, but we will get through them. If I do need to leave it to a more appropriate point, I'll definitely come back to it. So hang on there. I'm sure I will have had your questions. Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Neil Perry, and today we're going to be looking at how we can archive an Exchange server using the MailStore server platform. Just before I begin, if you do have any questions as I run through the webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button bottom left in the video. If you're watching this as a pre-recorded video, then we're always keen for you to add any comments you like below, and we'll come back to them and answer them there. Near the end of the video as well, there are contact details should you want to get directly in touch with us. So if we just have a quick look at the agenda for today, I'm going to start off by just talking briefly over sort of main features of MailStore, and then we're going to focus in how it works specifically in an Exchange environment. But as we go a bit further into the demonstration, you'll hopefully see that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is totally relevant for different mail platforms, hosted Exchange platforms, different Imap servers, even if you use an RMD mail server platform. So whereas it is based on an Exchange deployment, it's not by any means very different if we're looking at different mail platforms. Once we've gone through the demonstration where we'll see the software, set it all up, and then look at how users connect, we'll just wrap up with some next steps, things that you can do after this webinar to find out more about the software, hopefully download a copy yourself and test it out in your own environment, and then finally I'll definitely leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So to start with, what is MailStore? Well, it's actually a Windows-based software solution for archiving email platforms. So by that I mean it's a piece of software you install on a Windows machine. It doesn't necessarily have to be a server platform. It will work quite happily on a Windows 7, Windows 8 machine if required in a very small business environment. Usually, though, we tend to find that it's installed on a Windows Server platform for on-premise archiving of a mail platform. Now the mail platform may be local on premise like an Exchange server, or it could be a mail platform that's distributed in the cloud. So it could you could be archiving Office 365 or Google mailboxes or remote IMAP mailboxes or any mixture of the above. The nice thing about MailStore is it's very easy to connect to multiple different mail sources and bring it all into one archiving solution. Now today I'm going to be concentrating on the on-premise solution. There is also a private cloud edition. If that's of any interest, if you're thinking, oh, it's quite a nice package this, but I'd like to be able to build solutions for multiple customers, there is a totally different webinar all about that environment. But today we're going to be talking about the on-premise solution. When email gets archived into MailStore, it's always deduplicated. So if you've got scenarios where you've got lots of user mailboxes that you're archiving, but a lot of that mail is shared between users. Some customers, we tend to see that they send an email to 10 recipients, exactly the same email. That's quite a wasteful use of space in a typical Exchange server because the same message is stored multiple times. As that message gets archived into MailStore, it deduplicates. Only one copy of the message will exist in the underlying database, even though multiple users will see that message in their own archive. On top of deduplicating of specific messages, all attachments are compressed as well. So if you're sending an email with an attached file and then that message gets forwarded on, or the attachment gets just forwarded on in a new message, again, there's no need to store that multiple times. It will be deduplicated and the data gets compressed at a binary level. So between those two processes, you tend to find that the MailStore archive, the space required for the MailStore archive, is typically about half that of the same space required in an Exchange archive. And it can be a lot less. It all depends on the amount of duplicate mail you hold in your Exchange database currently. We tend to find the general average is about half. Users have access to MailStore. It's by no means just an archiving platform for a single administrator to find messages in. The whole process allows users to log in, usually through the Outlook add-in, and that would then allow them within Outlook to search their archive, browse their archive, the folder structure that has been archived from the mail platform, so they can very easily find the messages they may want to. There's a very powerful search in there as well, so they can do that all within Outlook. If they're roaming users, then there is also a web access mode, and also a mobile version of that if you want to get access out on the road on small screen devices. And there's also, I don't really touch on this in this webinar, but there's also an Imap server for things like Mac clients, where you potentially, you could use the web interface, but if you want integration within the mail software, the mail client, then you can add that through an Imap server. As well as archiving mail servers, MailStore allows you to bring in other existing archives or sources of mail from email clients, and also from PST archives. So that's great if you've got the scenario where you've already had users creating their own PST archives on their own machine, but you're then in the scenario where you're having to sort of back all these remote PST files up to be sure that you've got all of their email. You can bring all of those PSTs into MailStore and store them all centrally. So how does MailStore work? Well, what I want to introduce here is a very basic scenario for an on-premise Exchange server. So this hopefully is familiar to everybody. You've got your server on site. Internet email arrives and is sent via an internet gateway. So we've got SMTP email coming in generally into Exchange, and then their email clients connect also into Exchange. They may be local clients using Outlook, they may be using Outlook Web Access, or they may be remote active sync clients. And of course, they could also be remote clients. It doesn't really matter. The important thing here is that all email flows through the Exchange server and is stored and kept in the Exchange server. So in that environment, we want to install MailStore on a local machine. Now, it can be the Exchange server, and typically that's where MailStore gets installed, on the same physical server. But there's no need for it to be installed on the Exchange server. It can equally be installed on another local server or virtual machine, and this is very popular to install it on a VM, maybe on, sometimes customers have a 2012 server with multiple VMs running, one of which is their Exchange server, one of them is a MailStore server. You have the option. The other nice thing here is MailStore is very easy to migrate. So if you go down one path and you think, well, I'll install it on the Exchange server, but at some point you think, well, actually, I'd rather it be on its own server, you're not by any means limited. You can very easily move that installation to another server in the future. But let's just assume a very basic installation, and it's installed on the Exchange server. MailStore has a database backend. It actually, by default, uses a Firebird database. So it doesn't require a SQL license. It's self-contained. It's a single installer. It's very quick and easy to get up and running. That obviously is where your compression happens. The data is encrypted, and the single instance store allows for deduplication to minimize the amount of space required for the archive. MailStore also doesn't just use one mail archive database. It automatically generates a new one. The default is every 500,000 messages, and that way it means that over time you're not getting a database isn't growing and growing to a point that it slows to a crawl. It's keeping it well within the limits of what the Firebird database structure should be. Now, the first thing we want to do in MailStore is synchronize users, because users allow us to, well, do a couple of things. It allows clients to log in, so there needs to be a user for them to log in using, but it also allows MailStore to know which accounts it's going to archive for, because the users are often married into the actual archive jobs, which we'll come to in a little while. Now, user synchronization, from a very basic level, if you've only got 4 or 5 users, you could easily just create these users manually. There's nothing stopping you just adding users into MailStore, assigning them a password, and that's absolutely fine. You'd have to give them an email address as well, but those things can be all self-contained within MailStore. Typically, the customer setups we come across, they'll be synchronizing with a local Active Directory, and I'll show you that in process, how we can actually get that set up. It's very straightforward, but it means that MailStore is synchronizing with Active Directory. No passwords are ever stored in MailStore. They're looked up live from the Active Directory. Typically, what we like to do is when we are synchronizing with Active Directory, we create a group, an AD group, and only synchronize users of that group. That way, it's very clear that we're only archiving users that we want to archive for. Active Directory often will have additional service accounts, administrator. We will be creating a specific user called MailStore as we go along, so we don't want to add that as a mailbox to archive this way. So we create a group in AD and we're synchronized with that group. The user synchronization also will run automatically in the background. So if you add a new user to the network and you add them into this AD group, there's nothing else to do in MailStore. MailStore will pick up on this new user and start archiving email for that user. So getting your user synchronization set up is key, really, to a nice, easy-to-use system. So once you've got your users created in MailStore, we can then start creating archive jobs. And this is really the main way MailStore works, is you create an archive job and you can create as many of these different jobs pulling data from different sources. The first job that we'd really be interested in is managing users' own archives. Here we go. So if you imagine the scenario where we've got individual user mailboxes for these several users here, we want to get email coming into MailStore and sorted for those users. So what we actually do is we set up a journaling rule in Exchange. And the reason for this is it means that as mail arrives into Exchange, before it even gets delivered to the user's mailbox, a copy is taken. That copy is put into a journal mailbox. And then MailStore goes and collects that journal mailbox, typically over the Outlook Web Access ports. It's actually a HTTPS secure connection, which is why MailStore can be installed on any machine. It can easily, as long as you've got Outlook Web Access to the Exchange server, then MailStore can get access to the data. When it collects this copied email, it then sorts it based on the email address, either who it's been sent to or who it's been sent from, effectively. So if an email is coming inbound and it's going to a user Fred on your network, then MailStore will pick up and think, oh, that's an inbound email for Fred, and put it into Fred's own archive. If it's going out from Fred, then it would pick up on the message and think, oh, that's Fred sending a message, and put it into Fred's outbound archive. Now, as a basic setup, journaling works really well, and you would, from this point onwards, MailStore would be taking a copy of all email in and out of the server, sorting it for the relevant user, and putting it into their own personal archive. The issue here is that users only ever see new email, so existing email is not taken care of. This is only mail that's arrived since you've configured the job, and users kind of bundle all of their outbound email into one folder and all of their inbound email into another folder. So to take it that as a stage further, I've lost my mouse. There's my mouse. There we go. We typically set up a second job that pulls in users' mailboxes. So this job's role is to go and connect to Exchange as a power user, as a user that has impersonation rights, which I'll show when we run through the demonstration. And it will collect mail for each of the users in turn from their mailbox and the structure. So if they've got a complex folder structure under inbox, for example, all of that is replicated in MailStore. So it's synchronizing what's in their current mailbox and bringing it into MailStore. Now, typically you would use both jobs, because the main disadvantage of taking this approach is there is always a possibility that mail gets to the email client, the client can see that message and delete it from the deleted items, and if they're quick enough, this job hasn't yet gone and polled that mailbox. So for compliance purposes, that's why we tend to still recommend doing a journaling job. But to bring in the mailbox structure, then we do a multiple user mailbox job this way. So the two kind of work together to provide both compliance and the structure and the historic email that users want to see. What we also do with this job is it allows you to manage what's in Exchange. So as you're collecting users' mail from users' mailboxes, it's an ideal opportunity to say, well, actually, I've now archived all of this mail. Let's delete some of the old mail. And this job can be configured to delete mail, let's say, that's older than a year, and trim down and prune, effectively, what's in those Exchange mailboxes. So this job does two things. It brings in the structure, but it also prunes and manages the Exchange mailbox, and allows you to free up an awful lot more space in Exchange, which will save you space, but also speed up your Exchange server. And that's another key reason why people come to MailStore, is because the actual reason they're looking at it is because they want to take a lot of load off their Exchange environment. There's years worth of email stored there that users don't really access very often. A couple of other jobs that you might need to set up. If you're using Exchange public folders, you can have another job that is designed specifically to pull in that data and store it in a user designed for public folders. That way, by bringing it into its own sort of store, you can then share that store out to those users who need access to those public folders. If it's quite a straightforward setup and you've just got one set of public folders that everybody needs access to, that's very straightforward to set up. It's one job, pull on all of the public folders, store them in an archive called public folders, and then share that archive out to everybody who needs access. If you've got quite a complex set of folders and you specifically need to have different rights for different users, then you may need to have different users set up for each group of public folders. So it's worth bearing that in mind when you're looking at the licensing for MailStore. And the final sort of job that typically we would come across is to archive those existing PST files. Best thing to do with MailStore here is to bring all those PST files together, make them accessible in one location that MailStore can get access to. So it might be that you just copy them across the network onto the MailStore server in a different directory, and then you can run a job to bring those PST files in and store them under the relevant user's archive. You can either do that manually if you've only got 1 or 2 PST files per user and there's only 10 users. That's probably perfectly capable of just setting up those jobs to bring those in manually. If you've got a large collection of hundreds of PST files across potentially hundreds of users, there is a method where you can script this and by sort of letting it automate the process of bringing the PST files in and storing them under the relevant user. Either way, this tends to be a one-time job. You've got these existing PST files, you want to bring them into the archive. Once it's all in the archive, those PST files are no longer needed. Some people will archive them long-term, on a tape drive somewhere, or a large backup, or they just delete them at that stage because they're no longer needed, they're a duplicate. So at this stage, let's switch to the actual demonstration. If I should have in the background, it's timed out, so we'll just log in. Okay, so I've got an example server here. It's Exchange 2010. What I've done already is I've downloaded the MailStore version 9 installer and literally just run through the installer and chosen the default location. I haven't configured it in any way. It just speeds up the process of being able to show you the actual demonstration. So before we actually go into MailStore and start configuring users and setting up jobs and things, there's a couple of things we need to do on the Exchange server well, first thing we need to think about is the actual Active Directory users and groups, but then we need to do some work in Exchange just to allow journaling to work and to get rights to be able to access other users' mailboxes. So to start with, what I want to do is I want to create a dedicated MailStore user and Active Directory user, and this account is the account that I'm going to use to access the other users' mailboxes later on. Just give that account a password. I don't want to change the password. In fact, I don't need to allow that. That's fine. Okay, so I've created the account. Now the next thing I want to do is to create an Active Directory group, and the reason for that is I don't want to archive a lot of these AD users that are nothing to do with the mailboxes, the actual mail that I want to archive. So I'm going to create a group just called Archived. And if I go into this group, and I'm just going to add the relevant users who I do actually want to archive mail for. So let's have a look. So we've got Fred, James, Neil, Zima, Ross. I think that's everybody I need. Not Mark. There we go. So that's just a very basic AD group with those users in. So in the future, if I add any more users to Active Directory, all I need to remember to do is make sure they're a member of this archived group, and they will automatically get archived into MailStore. So that's all I need to do in AD, quite straightforward. The next thing I need to do is I need to set up some, well, a couple of things in Exchange through the Exchange Management Console. The first thing I want to do is I want to set up a journaling rule, because I want to be able to journal a copy of all email coming in and out of the server and put a copy into the MailStore user's mailbox. Now, before I can actually journal into that mailbox, I need to make sure that user has a mailbox. So if I go into mailbox here, it's a little bit slow on the server, I'm afraid. So I need to create a new mailbox because it doesn't currently have a mailbox. Obviously, if you're on a later version of Windows, creating a user on the mailbox is a lot easier. You can do that in one step. So I'm just going to make sure that the MailStore user has a Exchange mailbox. There we go. Just a standard user mailbox. It's nothing special there. Okay. So now that the MailStore user exists and has a mailbox, I can now create a journaling rule. If I have a look, I don't think I've got any journaling rules yet. So a new journaling rule. I'll just call this rule MailStore Journal. So effectively, I'm going to say for all messages, send a copy of those messages to a specific user of the system, which is MailStore. Now, you can be a lot more specific here. I'm not going to do an advanced setup here, but if you really wanted to, you could say, well, I'm only interested in journaling messages for these particular email accounts. We're just going to keep everything simple and assume that it's all email that we want to journal. So I'll just create that rule. That's done. So those are the two things I need to do in Exchange. So now I'm in a position where all new email will be journaled and be stored under that MailStore account. Now, the final thing I need to do before I go into MailStore, this is all kind of background work because it's an Exchange environment, is I need to give that MailStore user more rights, because at the moment it can only see its own mailbox. Now, the way that we do that is actually through an Exchange PowerShell. It's called Impersonation Rights. Now, this is exactly the same procedure for any version of Exchange. The exact command you use changes, and in fact, if you use an Outlook Web Access, sorry, not Outlook, Office 365, then you still need to do impersonation rights, but in that scenario, you do it through a web interface. But fundamentally, what we're doing is we're allowing the MailStore user the ability to request mailboxes of other users. Now, to make my life a little bit easier, I've actually copied this command. I should have mentioned early on, actually, that all of these procedures here, they're all detailed in our setup guide, so don't worry about taking notes from this video exactly. But this is the actual PowerShell command. We're going to assign a new role called MailStore Impersonation, give it the Exchange role application impersonation to the user, and I've created a user called MailStore. So just save me typing all that in. If I cut and paste that into my Exchange management shell, that's the response I expect to get. It's telling me that application impersonation has been assigned to the user MailStore. Now everything should be done, and if we minimize that, we can now start looking at MailStore and how we actually configure the jobs to start archiving some mail. So on the desktop, when you install MailStore, there should be a MailStore client link. Now, the client is the Windows interface for managing MailStore, either as an administrator, or you can also log in through the client as a user and get a cut-down version of what a user is allowed to see. So when we run this the first time, it'll ask you which server do you want to connect to. I'm running everything on the same machine, so I can easily run as local host. The first time you run MailStore client, you should run it on the same machine you've installed MailStore on. I'll explain that in a minute why that is. But from then on, there's nothing stopping you installing the client on another machine on the network, or if you really need to, across the internet, and you can manage a MailStore installation remotely. This is all done through a HTTPS protocol. So I now try and connect to that server in the background. It's going to ask me, okay, what user are you going to log in with? Because I've just installed this, the user is going to be admin and the password is going to be admin as well. That will only work on localhost. You can't ever log into a MailStore server remotely using admin and admin. That's a security feature. So one of the first things I really recommend you do once you've logged in is change that admin account's password. I won't in this install just to keep things nice and quick, but for security reasons it makes sense to do that. So if I just maximize this and make it easy to see. here's the main MailStore interface, the client interface. So to start with, you get a nice dashboard that gives you an overview of the server, the spec of the server, how much space there is on the drives that are relevant to MailStore, exactly what version we're running. We see one of the very latest 901 build, due to be released very soon, so you get a little bit of a preview here. And then we've got some stats on the actual archive itself. Now, I've just noticed that I've got some messages in there, so I really should delete those in a little while. I was doing a few tests early on, so just ignore that. Normally that would be 0 messages. And then at the bottom, some licensing information. If you've just downloaded the trial, then the trial will give you 30 days fully functional features of MailStore. We've got some quick access links here to the main features, archiving emails where you set up jobs. There's where we can actually search through the archive and we can export some email, which hopefully we'll have some time to look at a bit later on. And then a link through to the admin tools where you set up all sort of server settings. That's quick links on the main dashboard page, but they're also always available on the left-hand column. So I tend to stick it to using these features because that's where you expect them to always be. Now, before I begin, I'm just going to just delete some archives. These really shouldn't be here, so I just want to make it look as clean as possible. Obviously didn't tidy up after myself when I did some tests this morning. This one will contain a few more. Okay, there we go. There we go. That's better. So that represents a clean installation. Sorry about that. So I've got 0 messages, and the base size is just the default size of the actual config database, which is about right, 9 megabytes. Okay, so the very first thing we need to do is think about our users and how we actually synchronize the Active Directory users that we've created. So if we go into Administrative Tools, under Users and Privileges, here's our users at the moment. There's only the admin user that we've logged in with, the basic user. What we actually want to do is directory services to synchronize with a directory of users. The options here are to do it to an Active Directory user, which is an Active Directory source, which we're going to use. Or if using MDaemon, there's a direct way of linking in with our MDaemon mail server, similar solution for Kerio and iSwap. And there's also, I won't talk about this here, but the application integration allows you to synchronize with the database on a remote site if it supports this application feature. That's very useful. We use that with our MDaemon server if you need to archive a remote MDaemon server, but that's more of a higher level webinar for another day. So we're just going to connect to an Active Directory source. Now, I tend to find that if you're on the same server as Active Directory, or even the same domain, you don't really need to populate any of these settings. If this machine is already a member of the domain, it hopefully should pick all this up. If you do need to have more specific settings, sometimes I come across scenarios where people want to synchronize with a particular a base DN in Active Directory, a point in the Active Directory tree, and the users only exist in that container, then you might change these details. But generally speaking, we leave all of these at the default settings and let it auto-detect. I'm only interested in synchronizing Exchange users. That's absolutely fine, so I'll leave that option on. I'm only interested in synchronizing users that are active users of Exchange, which is fair enough, and I'm only interested in synchronizing users that are in the address list. Now here is where I define, well, which group do I want to synchronize with? By default, it's all users in AD, which is why I don't really want to do that. I want to select the group that I created before called archived. I'll leave it on the default user name format to use the SAM account default. Again, certain scenarios, not many, but you might want to change that, but generally speaking, you keep it as default. And then this option down here to delete users in MailStore server automatically. Well, what that's saying is if the user no longer exists in that group, do I also remove the user? And it's only the user, no archives are ever deleted. Do I also remove the user from MailStore? And ideally, that's worth doing, because if a user does leave the company, it's nice to say, well, I'll remove them from MailStore, and then I've recycled an account, a license as well. Then I can click on Test Settings, and it will now tell me what it's about to do. So if I just expand this a little bit so we can see what's going on. It's found those users that are in that AD group. It knows their full name because it's pulled that from AD. It knows the full AD path, and it also, most importantly, knows the SMTP email address. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that how the SMTP email address is stored in Active Directory is quite important here, because when it's journaling, it's going to be looking and matching against these addresses. So, and it always looks at the primary address first. So it's important that those are correct. If you've got any issues there, if you've got, sometimes I come across Active Directory where people haven't stored the email address, not in an Exchange environment because it pretty much has to be there in an Exchange environment, but in other environments you might not store an email address and then we can have issues. But in an Exchange deployment, those should be automatically populated. So I'm happy that those users are fine, so I can now actually manually synchronize those users and add them into MailStore. If I go into the user list here, now I've got my users, and that's what I want to see. I want to see that the users exist, they have email addresses, and that I can see that their authentication method is automatically using directory services. So now that I've got some user accounts, I can now start archiving some email. So if I go into Archive Email, this is where we create archive jobs, archive profiles. So we can archive from an email server, and we've got quite a few options here. We'll be looking at Exchange today, but you can see you can pull email from Google Mail platforms, RMDemon Mail Server, Carrier or iSwap. We won't talk about MailStore Proxy today, but that's primarily for if you're using remote POP3 servers and you want to sort of capture email through a proxy, or any generic IMAP or POP3 server. We could, again, might not have time to talk about this today, but we can if we want to. If we've got email specifically in any of those email clients that only exist in those email clients, occasionally come across scenarios where people have pulled email into like a Windows Mail client over POP3 and it only exists there, then you can get the data directly out of the client. And you can also archive from email and MSG file format, PST files, which we will look at later on, or Mailbox file formats as well. So what we're interested in doing is archiving from Exchange, and the first thing we're going to do is that journaled email, a journaled copy. So there are 4 options here. We can archive a single mailbox. Not what we're going to do straight away, but if you did want to just pull in a single user's mailbox out of Exchange, that's the option to use. Multiple mailboxes is when we log in as one user and then ask for mailboxes of many users. That's what we will do later on with that MailStore account. Public folders, kind of self-explanatory. If we want to pull in a public folder, then you log in as a user that has rights to see that public folder and then bring that in separately. Or the 4th option, which is what we're going to use now, is in an outbound email automatically, effectively journaling. And that's when you're collecting a mailbox, but you want to sort the mail based on the email addresses in the message headers. So that's different because the other options just store them directly into a folder and they don't sort it in any way. So we're going to pull in the journaled email, so it's this 4th option. Now we need to start providing some details about where is the actual Exchange server that we're connecting to. The access method, generally speaking, we will leave it as HTTPS. There's no need to change that. It seems to be the most efficient and secure method. You can just do Outlook Web Access over HTTP, but again, you're losing the level of security. And if you need to, you can pull it in over POP3 or IMAP protocols, but we tend to not recommend doing that. So we'll leave it on HTTPS. I'm using self-signed SSL certificates, so I like to tick this option to ignore any potential SSL warnings. If you've got root trusted certificates, you shouldn't need to use that. We come across both scenarios, so for argument's sake, it's usually best to leave that option on. Now, where's the host? Now, we can type in here now a local IP address, a local NetBIOS name, or it can be a remote, fully qualified domain name. As I've installed MailStore on the same machine as Exchange, I can use localhost because that's valid because in this environment, but you may well be connecting to a remote server at this point. I'm going to log in as that MailStore account that I created because I know the username and password for that. I specifically created it for MailStore, and I know that the journal mail is being put into that mailbox for MailStore. So I've given it the password. There is the option to define a mailbox here. Well, as it is the mailbox for the root mailbox for the MailStore account, I don't need to add it there, but I could just say, well, I want the MailStore at the address to say I want that specific mailbox here. So I'll just click test to make sure that I've got the details right. Connection could be established, so that's great. Now, every time this job runs, I like to tick this option to say synchronize with Active Directory. It just means that throughout the day it is constantly checking Active Directory to say, are there any new users? Should I add them first? Because you don't want a journal email for a user if the user doesn't exist. In that scenario, if you happen to have forgotten to add a user into MailStore, an email gets archived, gets journaled, and it's going to an email address that it can't match against, you have two options. The default option is what we generally use, is to keep archiving that message but put it into a general catch-all archive under a folder called unknown email addresses. That way it is in your archive, you haven't missed it, but it's not really assigned to anyone specifically. An admin user could then go and find those messages. And in the future, if you needed to, you could move them into the correct archive. It just allows you to catch those odd email addresses that exist in the system but may not exist and may not point to specific users. The other option is to not archive them at all and leave them in the journal mailbox. I don't like using that option because if you're not keeping an eye on things, that journal mailbox can just fill up and fill up and fill up of messages that you've forgotten to add email addresses for in MailStore. So I prefer to archive them myself. Now, if you think about this journal mailbox, mail that is in there is copied email. So every time we archive mail from that mailbox, I want to delete them in the original mailbox on Exchange. I don't want that Exchange journal mailbox to fill up and get bigger and bigger over time. That mailbox is there as a temporary location for mail until MailStore has archived it. As soon as it's archived those messages, it deletes them because it's a copy. Oh, actually, I jumped ahead of myself there. In certain scenarios, when you create a user the first time in Outlook, there is an option here. This is actually a button to open Outlook Web Access. In fact, I'll click and see if we can get it to connect. There's I'm using a self-signed certificate, so okay, I've got pointed to the wrong location. There we go. So this just allows me to double check that MailStore user is set up and running using Active Directory. There are certain scenarios where this, on older versions of Exchange, if you haven't logged in at least once using Outlook Web Access, you can't connect to it through MailStore, because MailStore is connecting using the Outlook Web Access protocol, so it's simulating exactly what we're doing through OWA. So it's worth noting that it's really only applicable because we've just created that MailStore account. So I'll sign out there. The last settings is just a timeout to say, you know, if I get no response, how long do I wait before I time out? So I'll just leave that on the default 300 seconds. Now, the job needs to be given a name. The default name is Exchange Journal MailStore. Well, that's fine for this purpose. But if you want to name them things you can remember, that's okay. There, you can change it. You can change it any time as well. Now, the options are to run automatically, or I should say run once as soon as I click the finish button, which I'll do in a minute, or to run automatically in the background. I'll come back to that in a moment because I want to explain differences in version 9 for what it means by run automatically in the background. So I'm just going to click finish, and this job should now run once. Now, there isn't really anything in that mailbox, unfortunately, because this isn't really a live server, it's a test platform. But what it's done there is it's connected, checked that mailbox, and then sorted the mail for that user. But it's only run once. You see, it's run, and it won't run again until I literally right-click on it and click run again, and then I can manually run that many times. So just to simulate something's going on, I'm actually going to just switch over to an Outlook install and just send a test message, because I want to simulate some new mail arriving. So if I send this to email-archive.co.uk, that's from Neil. So this is just the user Neil sending a message to the user Fred. And if I just minimize that, give it a couple of seconds to allow Exchange to actually process that message. And now if I run this job, hopefully it should find that message and archive it. So you can see it's found one message, and then in a minute it should archive it. So one item has been processed, one newly archived message. So that's telling me that it's found one message and it wasn't in the archive, so it has had to archive it. If we go and look at our actual archives on the left-hand side, we should now see that we've got expansion little triangles next to Fred and Neil, because Neil sent a message, so there's a copy of that message in my journaling outgoing, and it arrived in user Fred, so the same message is visible in Fred's journal incoming. There's only one message in the archive, it's just that both archives here can point to that message. So that's working as expected. Now, I mentioned before that I want to, that job needs to run automatically in the background. It's no good just coming in here, every so often clicking run. You want it to happen automatically. And this is where you can change the mode to automatic. Once you're happy the job's running as expected, you can switch to automatic mode. And this will run this job continually, but with a break of, and this is the default, 300 seconds or 5 minutes between the jobs. So it's not running, getting to the end and starting immediately. It's running, waiting 300 seconds, then start again, waiting 300 seconds, then start again, and effectively it'll run all day long, 24 hours a day, like that. On a very lightly used server, you could possibly even drop that maybe to 2 minutes or even 1 minute if you want to sort of be polling that mailbox more or less continuously. There's a bit of a trade-off there. Generally speaking, people are happy to know that messages get archived at least every 5 minutes. If you do feel that you want to not have too much impact on the server in a particular time of day, then you can exclude a time range. So you might say, well, I'm happy journaling these mail, but between 9 o'clock in the morning and 12 o'clock in the, I don't want to archive those mail because I've got a lot of messages going on in Exchange and I don't want to put extra load on the server. I haven't yet found a scenario where that's the case. The impact seems to be so small that it's not needed, but it's maybe more applicable to some of the other jobs later on. So I'll leave that option off and just say, in this scenario, we'll put that back to the default of 300 seconds. So now the job is running automatically, and you can tell that because it's got this little icon that's changing, and also down here under current state, it'll say running and should be waiting in the background. When a job has run, you can then have a look at the results to see the status of that job. So here you can see that I ran the job manually twice, there was no new messages, and then I ran it that time where it archived one message, and it's also run again since and archived no new messages because there hasn't been any new messages. The start time and the end time is here as well. That's really good over time because it allows you to see how long your job's taken to run. I mean, obviously this is a very lightly loaded system when you archive one message, but typically, you'd be archiving, maybe 100 messages every 5 minutes, and it'd be taking it maybe 20-30 seconds to do that. So it should be a low impact on your Exchange environment. But this allows you to go down and look at the history of a particular job. So that's our journaling taken care of. But what if I want to bring in my existing users' mail? I want to actually set up a second job, and that's where I want to go into Exchange again. I want to archive my Exchange server, but this time I'm interested in archiving multiple mailboxes. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to ask for the contents of many users' mailboxes. Same server, same settings, so I can use local host again. This time, well, the same as before actually, I'm going to log in as the MailStore user because that user, if you remember, we gave impersonation rights, so I have the rights to see other user mailboxes. That's the password for the MailStore account. A few different options this time. Because we're dealing with mailbox and folders, we get the option to decide, well, which folders are we actually interested in archiving. We don't have to archive the whole folder structure and everything below it. We can define that here. And in fact, by default, it always excludes deleted items, drafts, junk email folders, and the outbox. It doesn't pull those in. If you want to pull any of those in, then you can untick that option. But if you wanted to, I'm not going to on this job, but if you wanted to, you could include specific folders and not anything else, or exclude specific folders here. The filter is to say things like, do I archive messages that are unread? Well, yes, I tend to think that's a good idea. It doesn't matter if the user has or hasn't read it yet, I'll still want to archive it. Do I only archive messages that are older than either a date or a range? I don't tend to use this option. I'm of the opinion that it's good practice to archive everything in a user's mailbox, even if it's only just arrived. And that way, when we think about users' access and when they're looking for things, they don't have to think, oh, well, the archive only contains email that's older than 6 months, let's say. They can know that everything that should be in the archive. It may be some duplication in Exchange, but it does mean that they can always find everything in the archive. But you have the option there. The important option here is the delete option. Whilst I'm archiving messages, should I delete old messages? Now, while you're trialing the software, we recommend not to delete anything. Think of MailStore as just a copy of your mailboxes. It's not actually deleting anything. But long term, if you actually want to purchase the product, then this is where you would say, if a message is older than, let's say, a year, then delete it. Only if it's archived. It's effectively saying if it's archived, then delete it, and that's how you would do it there. But I'm going to leave that off because that's how we would trial the software. There's our timeout, 300 seconds, and then the batch processing is saying, well, if I'm archiving multiple users' mailboxes, how many shall I do simultaneously? There's no need just doing one and then another, then another. You can have up to 25 simultaneous connections going on at once. The default's 5, and I'll leave it on 5 for this setup. Now it's going to ask me, well, which of my currently installed MailStore users do you want to archive email for? And this is where it's going to be passing these addresses to Exchange and saying, please give me the email for Fred at email archiver, co.uk, etc. So you can say all of these accounts, or you could be more specific. You could say all of the accounts apart from these ones, or you could say, well, I'm only interested in these ones. So especially if you've got a large number of users here, you might find that this first time you run this job, there's a lot of email to archive. So you might say, well, I'll only just do a batch of users first. Then once they're caught up, I'll then add some more users and build this job up over time. If you've only got a handful like I have, then it's probably best just to leave it on all email addresses. There's that option again to synchronize the Active Directory services. There's no harm really in kicking that off every time this job runs as well. The more the merrier, just to be doubly sure that there aren't any missed users. There's the name of the job. I'm going to run it manually as soon as the job finishes, and obviously I can tick the option to run it in the background as well. So we'll just run it manually once. So now this job will take a little bit longer because it's now going to go through all of the users' mailboxes and find lots of messages and archive them in the background. But hopefully it should catch up reasonably quickly. You get it's not a brilliant example because this isn't the fastest virtual machine in the world by any means. It's very, very low spec really. Typically, if on a fast environment, we should be looking at really hundreds of messages per second. In the very quickest sort of environments, it tops out at a maximum of about nearly 2,000 messages a second. Obviously, in this scenario, this is probably more realistic for sort of small business environments. You're looking more at sort of 10 messages per second. But even taking that into account, it won't take an awful long time, maybe a few hours, to bring in a large volume of email the very first time. From then on, hopefully, when this shouldn't be too much longer. Actually, I think there's about 400 or 500 messages in total. Once it's archived, it's then much, much quicker to then recheck that mailbox. So once this is run, I'm going to run it again and let it analyze, and we'll have two examples of a job taking a maximum amount of time versus a minimum amount of time. So we'll let that run in the background because it is. I think there's some larger messages near the end, so it's taking a little bit longer. And as it's archived, and if I come back over here and expand, can I? There we go. So I'm starting to archive messages now for multiple users. So you can see that I know this user Neil has an inbox in multiple folders, and here's all the messages that it's been archiving. MailStore allows you to view HTML-based email as well, so it's very easy to navigate and see actual messages. As I'm still as an admin user at the moment, but as an admin user, I can be given rights to look at those mail. What I really want to do, I think, has that job finished now? Yes, that job's finished. So now that I know it's archived a larger volume of email, I'll just quickly run that job once more manually, and then that should run quite quickly. There, and it's practically done. There you go, done. So that's the sort of typical run time to check 400 messages. Even if you've got tens of thousands, the typical time it would take to rerun this job is usually seconds or minutes. It's no longer than that. It's very efficient in version 9 to keep on top of those mailboxes. So what you can actually do now is you can run this job automatically. In version 8, we used to say run this job once a day with a scheduled task just to keep the mailboxes up to date. But now, because it's so much quicker at saying what's changed, you can run this job all day long. You may want to now think about, well, I don't want to be putting too much load on the server through office hours, and I'll just do this out of office hours. But to be honest, in a lot of the installs I've worked on, we've left this on the default, and it doesn't seemingly, it hasn't made any real impact on the Exchange environment. Now, because of that, it almost, if you've come across MailStore before and you've thought, well, why are we journaling? If we're checking this mailbox all the time, why do we need to journal? And you could argue that that job alone may take care of your requirements. The only sort of real issue is there's a slight chance that a message could arrive, go into a user's mailbox. That user could delete that message straight away, delete it from the deleted items, and then this job that we've just created wouldn't actually see it. So for true compliance, that's why we still use a journal mailbox job. But I do have some customers that in version 9 are saying, well, actually, I'm quite happy that I'm just going to have one job. In which case, it simplifies the whole setup even further. So that job hopefully should have run now. Yeah, it's run a few times. It's literally taken a few seconds to run and check what's in the mailbox. Yeah, 4 seconds. So it's very quick to rerun through a job. So we've now got our jobs running, that everything's been archived into MailStore, but I really want to finish off by looking at how it appears to users of the system. So if I just close Outlook, because I had it running in the background, what typically users would connect into MailStore using the Outlook add-in. Now, where do they get that Outlook add-in from? There's actually a link on the server. When you install MailStore, it creates this folder here, install MailStore client on other computers. That's just a link to the installer folder for the Outlook add-in and the MailStore client. We're interested in running the Outlook add-in, so you'd copy that to the client machine, or you'd make it available over the network. I'll just quickly run through an install of the Outlook add-in. Click finish. There we go. It's as simple as that. So you can do this with group policies as well. If you're thinking of lots of users, there's instructions on how you can do that. If we now run up Outlook, log in as the profile I was using before. Okay. What you should see in the top of Outlook is this MailStore tab, and this is the add-in. This allows users to see their archive and search for items in there. There's a very basic search here, and typically if you just know an email address and you want to look for that straight away, you could type it in there. Or there's a more advanced search here. Well, I should say this is the first thing I've done, so I need to actually enter some details. And we'll also look at the browse archive. So because this is the first time this client has connected to the server, I need to give the server details. Localhost is fine because I'm on the same machine. Typically, you would put in now the server name or the internal IP address, or even the public fully qualified domain name if you're using this client outside of your network. You've got two options for authentication. Standard authentication is where you actually need to define a username and a password that matches the user and password in MailStore. Yes, it's connecting to Active Directory, so effectively the password is stored in Active Directory, but it's still the user as it's seen here. So I'm going to log in as the user Neil. I can't use the other option to use Windows authentication because I'm not actually logged into this machine as Neil. I'm logged in as an admin account because it's the server as well. But on a client, you could use Windows authentication. It would just pass the parameters for the current Windows account. So I'm going to use standard authentication. I'm going to remember the password so I don't need to enter it every time. So now it should be connected to MailStore in the background. And there we go. I've got my search options here. So I've got more advanced searches here. You can do very simple searches here for keywords. I think if I do SPA and I search across everything there, very quickly it comes back with all the results for that simple keyword. And that's looking in the subject, the body, attachment contents, which is quite important. That allows you to look within known attachment files for text within the attachment, sending recipient, and the attachment file names, I should say. I can also be more specific. So, if I say I only want to look at a subject for the word SPA, then I'm going to get a few results. I may want to only look in specific archive folders. So I know that as user Neil, that this message is going to be in, let's say, the Groupon folder. I can define a folder there and search for it. As it happens, all those messages are in the same folder. Or I can compound my search result a little bit by saying, well, I know it's going to be from a particular address, and I'm looking for, messages with a subject, whatever. I can look at a date range. I can also say I'm only interested in results with or without attachments, priority, or specific sizes. So you've got a quite powerful set of search criteria there that you can use to find the messages, and it is very quick. Version 9 is significantly quicker than version 8 for actually searching and coming up with results. So users can use this to find messages. As soon as you find a message, then it's just a case of clicking on it, and you can view it directly in Outlook. You don't have to restore it. You can look at it straight away. If I actually want to deal with that message, then I can click on the message, click on Open Message, and then it gets opened within Outlook as a message. And if you imagine now, and it's not a very good example because it's not really a personal message, but I could just reply to this message or forward it on. I don't again have to restore the message to use it. It's just there to be used in Outlook straight away. If I do specifically want to restore it, let's say, well, I do want to put that back into my folder, I could choose Restore Message, and you get this option to say, well, this represents the message, drag it and drop it into your inbox, and I've now got a copy back in my mailbox. Should I particularly want to do that? As well as searching, there's one other option actually. Within searching, if you tend to use a search many times and you want to sort of repeat that search, then you can save the search and give it a name, and it will appear as a saved search. And that's under the Browse Archive option. Browse Archive is a bit like saying, well, show me everything I have as user Neil in the archive. So there's my folder, there's my journal mail, there's messages that are in the folder structure. And I can just navigate around the whole folder structure and find messages just like a mailbox. But right at the bottom there's also My Saved Searches, and there's, oops, I'll just expand it a little bit. Where's it gone? There we go. There's that sparse search that I did, and it appears like a search folder in Outlook. So you can define multiple search folders, and there's probably a good way of naming them, and just rerun them automatically like that. So that's really the main features for users. Users don't tend to need to do much more than look and manage their archive through Outlook add-in. Just to before I finish off, I appreciate we're running a little bit low on time. The other methods for connecting users, the primary one is the MailStore web access. That runs over a HTTPS service on port 8462, but these are configurable if you need to change them. Again, you can make that publicly accessible. It's just one port to make visible externally. You get this login screen. You then log in as the user you want to log in with. Don't need to remember passwords, and it's a very similar interface to what you've just seen within Outlook. There's your folder tree on the left side and all our messages. I can view the HTML content. Yes, I'm happy to view that. I probably picked a really bad example there. And also I've got the advanced search capabilities exactly the same as before. And interestingly, it does carry them across, because it's the Outlook web interface the Outlook add-in is actually sharing the same protocols here, the same interface. So if you've just done a search in one, then that last search is available. My saved searches are still available here. So it's a very quick and easy way for users to get access to everything in MailStore without having to have a client at all. And I mentioned before there is a mobile version of the client. So if you connect to this web page through a mobile device, then you're going to get a much simpler, cut-down version. Now, finally, just before I sort of wrap up, it's always nice to just explain a little bit about how MailStore's storing data. I've just come back to the MailStore server installation here. I just wanted to point out under the storage section, Administrative Tools Storage, here are my storage locations. This is where it's actually storing the data in individual, what they call archive stores. The default one is called Default File Group, and that is a folder. On a fresh install, it's in your C drive, but this can be on any drive. It can be moved onto a different drive. It contains a database, which is containing the message headers, and then actual data files that contain message body information. There's an option here that's on by default, but I'll show you anyway, that says, if the store reaches 500,000 messages, then create a new store in that path. And that way, you may find over time, as your archive grows, you've got multiple stores here. The actual version 9 limit has now been lifted to 5 million messages, which seems quite high, to be honest. So I'm still at the moment sticking to 500,000. It seems to be, it makes more sense to me to use that value. But it's best to leave it on that option. I've found. I've tried in the past creating new stores monthly, quarterly, but you end up with a large number of stores. From a performance point of view, it's better to have a smaller number of stores that aren't too big, and in my opinion, about 500,000 messages seems to be perfect. That way, you'll get nice, quick searches. So the default settings, effectively, you shouldn't have to change these, but just in case you look in here and want to know what the options are. And this is where you can right click and you can start doing things like move those. You can detach them, move it to a new location, and reattach it. Let's say you installed it onto the C drive, and then later on decide, well, actually, no, I don't want to keep all my archives on the C drive. I want to actually create them on a separate drive that I've got. You can move them across, reattach them, and carry on. You don't have to rebuild MailStore from scratch. You can have these stored on network shares as well, or NAS devices. That's all possible. A little bit more extra work to do with authentication, but that's not uncommon. What we don't recommend is changing the location of the master database. The master database in MailStore is the settings that we're configuring when we set up jobs, when we define users and things. It's a very small file, typically only a few megabytes, but that is much better if that's kept on a local disk. It is possible, but we don't recommend running that on a network share. If you lose connection to that, there are scenarios where that data can get corrupted. So that really sort of concludes the main sort of overview of MailStore. If I just switch back now. Oops, no, not that one. Switch back here. There we go. Just to sort of up the webinar, really. Next steps, if you haven't already, I do strongly advise you download a 30-day trial. You can click on the link here to do that. It's fully functional for 30 days. All we ask for is an email address, contact information, just so we can keep in touch. We're very keen to help you with that process. So, download it, install it. Have a look at the help section initially that's also linked here, that will give you all the guides that I've been following effectively for different deployments. I mean, we're talking about Exchange today, but there are guides for all different mail platforms. That's a good starting point. If you then do need any help, feel free to get in touch. If you're trying the software, we're more than happy to help. We can remote in and talk through a few things as well. I tend to find it's easier to do that with people remotely than try and explain every single scenario over, through a webinar. That's key for that. It's easier to work on your setup. If you're a reseller of the software, if you're already a Zen software reseller partner, then just all you need to do to add MailStore to your partner profile is tick the option under your partner profile. You log into your account, and there's an option to say which products you want to resell. It's as simple as that. There is a free not for resale license. So if you're a reseller software and you want to use MailStore for your own internal mail platform, free license there, really a no-brainer. It's definitely worth having. We use it all the time for finding correspondence with customers. It's so quick to just type in an email address and get a full list of everything that anybody's communicated with them. And also, if you want to become a MailStore certified partner, there is additional discounts that can be applied for doing that. It's an online free course. It's just a case of really running through an online exam. There's a bit of background work to do first to learn all the ins and outs of the software, but it shouldn't take more than a few hours to go through the whole process and get yourself certified. So that wraps up today's webinar. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we're always interested in any comments you want to share with us. Hopefully that's been useful. Thanks very much. So I'm happy to hang around for a little bit longer now for any questions people may have. So feel free to drop them in the Q&A box bottom left in the screen. I know there's a little bit of a delay, so I'll stay quiet for a little while, and hopefully if there are any questions they'll come through. Also, if it's needed, I do have that demonstration in the background. I was just a bit aware that we were running a little bit over on time, so I didn't want to try and get too much down into this webinar, but if there's anything you sort of saw a glimpse of and thought, oh, can you talk about that, Neil, let me know, and I can maybe go into some other things a little bit more ad hoc. Oh, we seem to be losing viewers, so I'm assuming there aren't any questions coming. Of course, any time if you do want to drop any questions through, you're always welcome to email us support@zensoftware.co.uk, or all the information is on our main website. But give us a call, drop us an email. Happy to talk about. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'll close it there and keep an eye out for the next set of webinars. Thanks so much. Bye now.